Hey folks, I'm Dane Harden with Western Masters Martial Arts. Typically we'll do a Zen lesson or a Zen koan, but tonight I really wanted to speak more as the medical professional from the standpoint of violence. Violence is something that we can't control. It's going to come into our lives whether we want it to or not. Each of us is pre-programmed with how we would deal with violence. Typically, the natural physiologic event is called adrenaline-based response. Our body doesn't really like adrenaline. Most of us don't walk around living in an adrenalized state. So with that adrenaline-based response, our heart rate goes up, our respiratory rate goes up, and most of the time, fine motor coordination will go down. So it really does a lot of the things that we don't want it to do when we're in an emergency situation. A lot of people have this misconception that in an adrenalized state, they can lift thousands of pounds and they all of a sudden become Superman. But typically, there's the old saying that you don't usually rise to the highest level of training, but you fall to your lowest level of inefficiency. And that rule is a military rule that is really pretty common. That's why in the military we train so much. I was a flight surgeon in the military and flew hundreds or so, about 120 medevacs. That's a lot of trauma. So I understand the end game of what happens to someone after they're injured or wounded or beat up or stabbed. And I also served as a soldier, so I was there at the beginning game whenever the attacks occurred. So it's sort of like this continuum of violence. And in our civilian society, we're not as prepared for it as we would be if you were a soldier deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan and Bosnia, Kosovo, places like that. So one of the first things that we learn in classical martial arts is breath control. One of the first things that we teach soldiers is this idea of combat breathing, which is really very similar, almost in every facet of it, to breath control. So the breath control that you would learn in traditional martial arts is very much effective in a real combat setting. So a lot of the times when you hear someone kind of dismissing the traditional method, a lot of times maybe they don't understand the traditional method as well as they should. Once we start to control our breathing, we can start to bring our heart rate down to where we're at tolerable levels. And at that point, we can start to move. We break out of this idea of tunnel vision, where we're in an adrenalized state and we only really see what's in front of us. We control our breathing, central nervous system begins to relax, the heart rate slows down, our movement and our ability to move starts to restore itself, and we start to be able to see better. A lot of times in a violent state, you go through what's called an Ode Loop, where you observe and orient, try to make a decision, and you act. A lot of these things are talked about in books by Rory Miller on violence. If you want to read other good authors, Lieutenant Colonel Grossman has written books on killing and on violence as well. So there's lots of literature out there that come from people who have actually served in combat settings or police officers who have actually been in street fights. And it teaches some of this applicability of things that really do work. I'm an Aikidoist, but I was also a kickboxer, a Taekwondo guy, a swordsman, but I was also a soldier and a doc. And I will tell you that each one of those tools has its place in this continuum when we're talking about violent attack. Most of the time, Aikido will work when you utilize it with hand strikes and something to interrupt the attack in order to create an opening where you can get a joint lock. If someone's taking you to the ground, that's called the interim or transitional point. Aikido sort of lives in that world. Kickboxing is more of a stand-up martial art where we're trying to move around and understanding and using maneuver in order to strike our opponent. And of course, ground fighting, ground-based skills, you're trying to protect your airway, those sorts of things. All of those things relate to violence, to your response to violence, and to your very initial thing, which is going to be trying to control your breath, trying to control your heart rate, and trying to control the environment that you're in. Thank you very much. Hope you have a great week.